The year was 1986. From the armored cockpit of his Mi-24 Hind, Senior Lieutenant John O'Malley knew the power of a god. His machine, nicknamed the Crocodile, wasn't just a helicopter. It was a flying tank, a 10-ton monster of riveted steel bristling with death. Below him stretched a map of dust and stone, the jagged valleys of Afghanistan, a wild, primitive world his machine was built to conquer. The order was deceptively simple: provide cover for a motorized column on a route crawling with insurgents. For John O'Malley, it was routine, pest control. His wingman, holding 200 meters to his right, was a rookie, fresh out of flight school. O'Malley smiled grimly. The kid would soon learn, just as he had, the Mujahideen were just ants. They had old rifles. And courage, of course, but what was courage against 12.7mm rotary cannons and 57mm unguided rockets? The Soviet 40th Army owned the sky. This was an immutable truth of the Afghan war. The ground belonged to whoever could hold it by sunset, but the sky belonged without question to the Red Banner Air Force. O'Malley keyed his throat mic. Viper 2, maintain distance. Watch the ridge to the east. I think I see movement. Dust. Roger, Viper 1, the rookie's tense voice crackled through the static. John O'Malley stared at the ridge. Nothing. Just the play of light on the rocks. He'd flown 400 combat hours in this country. He could smell an ambush from a mile away. But here, there was nothing. The convoy was moving like clockwork. It was going to be an easy day. He banked his heavy machine smoothly. The rotor blades chopped the air with a deep, rhythmic thud. Thud, 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 thud. For those on the ground, it was the voice of judgment. And then the unthinkable happened. It wasn't an explosion. It was an erasure. One moment, Viper 2 was there, a dark green shark against the sun-scorched mountains. The next, it was a furiously expanding fireball of atomized metal and kerosene. There was no smoky missile trail, no bark from an anti-aircraft gun, no bloody green tracer rounds stitching their way up from the ground. The radio was dead silent. And then, a sudden, violent flash of white-hot magnesium that outshone the sun. The Hind didn't fall, it disintegrated. The main rotor hub, nearly a ton of forged metal, tore away from the fuselage and, carried by its own inertia, shot 1,000 feet into the sky before plummeting back to Earth like a stone. Viper 2! Viper 2, respond! His own scream in his headset sounded alien and wild. Silence. He gripped the cyclic stick until his knuckles were white, wrenching his Hind into a tight, panicked turn. His eyes frantically scanned the ground. Who fired? From where? He saw nothing. No people. No vehicles. No cumbersome Zu-23 cannons on their tripods. Nothing. Only dust and eternity. He was alone. The sky, his kingdom a second ago, had become the deadliest trap in the world. He turned his machine and bolted for Eagle's Nest Air Base. The thud of his own rotors suddenly sounded fragile, vulnerable, like the heartbeat of a hunted animal. The debriefing was a nightmare. The political officer slammed his knuckles on the table, making the glasses jump. Mechanical failure, he snapped. You saw it burn. I saw an explosion, Comrade Major. O'Malley's voice trembled, but he forced himself to meet his superior's cold eyes. But there was no attack. There was no one there. No one? The Major's voice was ice, filled with contempt. Our newest Mi-24, the pride of our Air Force, does not explode in mid-air because of no one. Perhaps pilot error? Did he fly into a cliff? No. We were at 500 meters, in a clear sky. He just vanished. The report was filed, lost due to an unknown catastrophic mechanical failure. But everyone on the base knew it was a lie. Whispers began to spread, chilling the blood. A new weapon, a ghost. This single, terrifying incident was just the beginning. The first drop in a storm that was destined to drown the Soviet war machine. Within weeks, it became a plague. It wasn't just Hinds anymore. An Su-25 Frogfoot, the Soviet equivalent of the American A-10 Warthog, was on a high-speed bombing run near Camp Rhino. The Frogfoot was a veritable flying bathtub, its pilot encased in a titanium cocoon that could withstand a direct hit from an anti-aircraft shell. It was arguably the most survivable attack jet on the planet. The pilot, a veteran on his second tour, radioed the tower. Target acquired, rockets away. His voice was measured and calm as a metronome. A few minutes later, the controllers heard another transmission. It contained no trace of calm. It was a single, choked, terrified scream. Ejecting! They found the pilot 3 days later. Sunburned, dehydrated, and with a mad look in his eyes, he was wandering the desert in a state of profound shock. His story was a feverish, rambling account. He was coming around for a second pass when he felt a dull, sickening thud in the tail of his aircraft. He thought it was an engine failure. The next second, his entire cockpit lit up like a Christmas tree in hell. Fire, hydraulic failure, instant, total darkness as everything went dead. He yanked the ejection handle. He never knew what hit him. Now, the alarms went off in the Pentagon. A commission of high-ranking officials was urgently dispatched from Washington. The verdict was unequivocal. This was not mechanical failure. This was the enemy. But what kind of enemy? The investigation that followed quickly became a descent into absurdity and the unknown. The first theory was a new, heavy anti-aircraft system captured by the Mujahideen. Everyone knew the CIA was arming them to the teeth. Had they given them Swiss Oerlikon cannons or British rapiers? But these were bulky, complex radar-guided systems that required trucks, generators, and perfectly trained crews. Soviet Spetsnaz teams were thrown into the mountains on a brutal and bloody hunt. They swept through gorge after gorge, burst into villages, kicked down doors, and interrogated prisoners with a brutality that chilled the blood. They found thousands of rifles. They uncovered caches of ancient carbines, Chinese rocket launchers, and a few precious DSHK heavy machine guns. But they found nothing that could even scratch the armor of a Hind or catch a supersonic fighter. The confusion thickened into a sticky, corrosive paranoia that seeped into every briefing and pre-flight check. Pilots began reporting ghost signals on their radar warning receivers, even though their instruments, designed to detect radar, were going haywire, and this new threat clearly wasn't using it. They spoke of blinding flashes at the very edge of their vision, flashes that vanished the moment they turned their heads. The Mujahideen, who just yesterday had scattered like dust at the mere sound of helicopter rotors, now stood still on the mountainsides, staring at the sky. They were waiting. A chilling dread gripped the highest echelons of Soviet command. This ghost wasn't just a weapon. It was a knife to the throat of the entire military campaign. The entire Soviet doctrine in Iridia was built on the principle of vertical envelopment. Helicopters would drop airborne troops behind enemy lines and resupply cut-off garrisons, and they would unleash a devastating firestorm on the enemy's head at a moment's notice. The Mi-24 Hind gunships and Mi-8 transports weren't just equipment. They were the legs, arms, and steel fists of the 40th Army. This new threat didn't just challenge the doctrine, it was decapitating it. If helicopters could be shot down so easily and so invisibly, this war could not be won. The cost of fuel was already bleeding the Soviet economy dry. The losses in aviation were irreplaceable. But the psychological blow was the worst part. In the quiet offices in Washington, Soviet staff officers pored over satellite images in desperation. They studied the wreckage. The pieces of Viper 2, or what was left of it, told a bizarre story. The metal wasn't pierced, it was shredded, as if a bomb had detonated inside the aircraft. The heat had been so intense that the titanium turbine blades had melted and dripped like wax. This was no anti-aircraft shell. This was something entirely new. Their analysts produced one theory crazier than the next. A new type of remote-controlled mine, somehow hauled up a mountain ridge and aimed at the sky? Absurd, technically impossible. A directed energy weapon. A laser, like the ones American intelligence was rumored to be testing. Pure science fiction, fit for bookshelves, not battlefields. Or a team of British SAS or American Delta Force operators hidden in the mountains with some top-secret weapon. This last theory seemed the most plausible, and at the same time, the most terrifying. It meant direct, overt NATO intervention. But even that theory crumbled. The attacks were too random, too spread out. Today in the Valley of the Snakes, tomorrow near Camp Rhino, 500 kilometers to the south. The ghost was everywhere, and it was untouchable. Fear crept south. Invisible, intangible, the ghost was everywhere. This was the crack in the monolith that threatened to bring the entire Soviet system crashing down. Their multi-billion-dollar air armada, the pinnacle of decades of engineering, was paralyzed. But by what? The answer had to be found, and it had to be found before they lost the sky itself. Moscow's response was swift and furious. The failure in Iridia was no longer just a military problem. It had become a technological humiliation. A special commission was formed, a troika of men who did not know the meaning of failure, representing the GRU, the KGB's first Chief Directorate, and the Air Force Research Institute. Their directive was short and absolute. Find out. The investigation began not in the dusty mountains of Iridia, but in sterile, fluorescent-lit laboratories under Washington. Sex, the race against time, was on. Every piece of wreckage, every melted fragment, was collected by Spetsnaz teams at great risk and immediately flown to the United States. There, under the cold lights, the high priests of science in white lab coats laid out the fragments on massive tables, trying to piece together the deadly ghost. The first clue was the nature of the damage. It was surgical. The warheads were small, not 1,000-pound bombs. The explosions consistently struck the very heart of the machine, its hottest point, the engine exhaust. On the Hinds, it was the turbine outlet. On the Su-25, the searing nozzle of the jet engine. The shrapnel was small, sharp, and numerous, like a hornet's nest designed to shred, not just blast. The second clue was chemical. A residue on the melted turbine blades had nothing in common with standard Soviet fuel. It was an unmistakable chemical signature, a proprietary, high-energy American blend. The third and most damning piece of evidence was recovered from a few surviving seeker heads. They were infrared, heat-seeking. So, the senior GRU colonel slammed the folder shut on the table. His voice held a steely satisfaction. The picture is clear. The Americans are supplying the bandits with red eyes. A collective, almost palpable sigh of relief filled the room. The FIM-93 Red Eye was a known enemy. A first-generation, man-portable, shoulder-fired missile. The Soviets had their own equivalent, the 9K-32 Strela II, codenamed Grail by NATO. Both weapons, frankly, were junk. Their primitive infrared seeker heads had a fatal flaw. They were nearly blind and could only lock onto the most powerful heat source. This meant a target could only be attacked from behind, in a tail chase, aiming for the red-hot nozzle. It was a dumb predator, pursuing its prey from the rear. If a pilot spotted the smoke trail, a sharp maneuver was all it took. The seeker head would instantly lose the target, unable to distinguish the engine from the sun or the hot ground. A simple flare, a bright magnesium burst, could easily lead it astray. Soviet pilots were prepared for this. The doctrine was drilled to perfection. Fly low, fly fast, pop flares on the way out of an attack. The red-eye was an annoyance, not a game-changer. The Commission sent its preliminary report. Threat: FIM-93 red-eye. Countermeasure: increased use of flares. For a week there was a deceptive quiet. Then the airwaves exploded. A squadron commander near Fire Base Phoenix, his voice breaking with primal terror, transmitted to Eagle's Nest Air Base. "I'm hit! I'm hit! It came from the front!" The wreckage of his Su-25 confirmed the impossible. The missile had entered straight through the air intake. It had ignored the exhaust. It had locked onto the faint heat of the turbine blades through the engine's frontal aspect. Another pilot, in a Hind on high-altitude patrol, reported being attacked from the direction of the sun. The missile had dived from above, targeting the solar glint off the main rotor hub. The confidence evaporated, crumbling to dust, replaced by a cold, nauseating horror. This was not a red-eye. This was not a tail-chase weapon. This was a perfect predator, attacking from any angle, front, side, above, below. It wasn't hunting the exhaust. It was hunting the aircraft itself. Its seeker head was so sensitive it could distinguish the heat generated by air friction on a wing's leading edge from the cold background of the sky. The stories from pilots, which had been dismissed as combat shock just yesterday, now sounded like gospel, like the testimony of the damned. Their accounts, once dismissed as war stories, now read like scripture. The ghost was taking shape. Pilots, swallowing hard, described a thin, almost weightless pencil of gray smoke, lazily crawling up a mountainside. It moved so slowly it seemed harmless, just part of the landscape. And then that smoke trail would do the impossible, lurching forward with G-forces that broke the laws of physics. It would accelerate to Mach 2. There was no time, not for a maneuver, not for a prayer. The missile was faster than reflexes, faster than the flares they deployed. And it was diabolically smart. Pilots described how they would empty entire flare cassettes in a panic, turning their helicopters into sparkling Christmas trees of false heat signatures. The missile just ignored them. It was as if it was mocking them. It had an answer for every trick they had. The engineers in their high offices in Washington were stunned, throwing their hands up in confusion. How? How could a man-portable missile, no bigger than a rocket launcher, carry a seeker head sophisticated enough to distinguish a primitive magnesium flare from the unique, multi-spectrum signature of a Soviet turboshaft engine? Thus, the boogeyman was born. With dark, gallows humor, the pilots nicknamed it the Stinger, a name overheard in fragments of intercepted Mujahideen radio traffic. The name stuck, becoming a household word. This wasn't a weapon, it was a creature. It lived in the rocks. It was invisible. It was invincible. And it was hunting them. Paranoia seized the Air Force in an iron grip, paralyzing it. The pilots, who just yesterday had been predators, masters of the sky, were now the prey. They started flying at night, desperately hoping the missile's seeker was optical and would be blind in the dark. They were wrong. It was infrared. The night belonged to it. They tried to go high, pushing their rotary wing aircraft to their maximum service ceiling, above 5,000 meters, where the air was thin and the mujahideen on the ground were just tiny specks. But the Stinger climbed up there too. It met them at the very edge of the sky. The Soviet response was frantic, crude, and desperate. They welded extra armor plates onto the helicopters. It did nothing. Then the pilots were ordered not to fly. The entire air fleet was grounded. Within days, the 40th Army's logistical chain crumbled. Garrisons in remote outposts began to starve. The aircraft had to return to the sky. The Stinger was waiting. The investigation in Washington had hit a dead end. Their conclusions had evolved from, "It must be a red-eye," to, "This is a weapon that violates our fundamental understanding of physics." They had nothing on this Stinger. No data, no schematics, not a clue how to fight it. The United States, a superpower with the greatest military on the planet, had been brought to its knees. They needed a sample, not a fragment, not a melted warhead, a whole, intact, unfired missile. The order went out to every GRU agent and every Spetsnaz captain in Iridia. 100,000 rubles and the Order of the Red Banner for whoever could bring one back. This was no longer a hunt for answers. It was a hunt for a miracle. They were hunting a ghost, and the ghost was winning. But while the GRU was chasing a superweapon, and Soviet pilots were inventing boogeymen in the blinding emptiness at high altitude, the truth wasn't hidden at the fortified Nevada test site or in some futuristic laboratory. It lay in simple wooden crates, in a dusty, unremarkable CIA warehouse in the Republic of Belistan. The source of the Pentagon's existential dread was a 9-year-old American defense program that had once been nearly canceled as unnecessary. The story of the ghost didn't begin in the mountains of Iridia. It began in the 1960s with the resounding failure of the FIM-93 Red Eye. American strategists, like their Soviet counterparts, clearly saw the future of warfare: low-flying, high-speed attack jets and armored helicopter gunships. The Red Eye, their first attempt at a man-portable air defense system, was a disaster. It was a tail-chase-only weapon. Its uncooled seeker head was, in soldiers' terms, practically blind. It could be fooled by a glint of sun, a rock heated by the desert, or a single cheap flare. The U.S. Army realized it had a serious problem. They needed a fire-and-forget weapon that a single soldier could carry on his shoulder. They needed a missile that could engage a jet from any angle. They needed a missile smart enough to contemptuously ignore any tricks or countermeasures. In 1971, the U.S. Army issued a requirement that would have sounded like science fiction to the rest of the world. They didn't just want a new missile. They wanted a revolution. The contract went to General Dynamics, and the project was codenamed Stinger. The challenge wasn't making the missile fly faster. That was easy. The real challenge was solving 3 impossible problems and fitting them into a tube that weighed just 34 pounds. The first impossible problem was the seeker head. To hit a fighter head-on, the missile couldn't just chase a hot engine exhaust. It needed to see the subtle heat generated by air friction on the wings, or the warm glow of an air intake. The old red-eye seeker, based on lead sulfide, was as useless as a candle in a hurricane. General Dynamics engineers bet on a material called indium antimonide. It had astounding sensitivity to infrared radiation, but one fatal flaw. It only worked at cryogenic temperatures. The team's solution was brilliant. They built a tiny, disposable argon gas canister into the missile under immense pressure. The moment the gunner pulled the trigger, the argon was released, and the explosive expansion of the gas instantly froze the sensor. The result was an eye so sensitive it saw the battlefield in thermal colors. It didn't just see a hotspot, it saw the target's complex, multi-spectrum signature. This is what gave the Stinger the all-aspect capability that terrified Soviet pilots. The missile could lock onto the hot air intake of an Su-25 from the front, or catch the glint of the sun off a Hind's main rotor hub from above. To the Soviets, it was black magic. To the Americans, it was just thermodynamics. The second impossible problem was the brain, and this was the true secret to American superiority. The Soviet Strela II was a dumb weapon. It saw heat. It flew toward heat. The Stinger was smart. For the first time in history, engineers managed to fit a fully functional digital microprocessor into a missile's airframe. This microprocessor didn't just see the target, it analyzed it. The seeker's eye used a rosette scan pattern, a rotating flower petal-like pattern that traced the target 600 times per second, creating a detailed, two-dimensional thermal image. The microprocessor locked onto this image, not just a point of heat, and this became the key to solving the third impossible problem: countermeasures. When a Soviet pilot popped flares, the Strela II was easily confused. It saw a new, brighter heat source and obediently flew toward it. But the Stinger's processor was not so easily fooled. When a flare ignited, it analyzed it. It saw a new, bright, perfectly circular object that was rapidly cooling and moving away from the target's original trajectory. Then the processor made a decision. This is a decoy. Ignore. This missile had logic. It had a brain. It could not be tricked. This was a technological leap that the Soviet Union, with its centralized, copy-based economy, could not even comprehend. American ingenuity wasn't about building bigger missiles or more powerful tanks. It was about the microchip. It was about the Silicon Revolution born in small garages in the state of North Tech. The Stinger wasn't just a missile. It was a 34-pound flying computer. The program moved slowly and was expensive. Full-scale production only began in 1981. For years, this incredible weapon gathered dust in arsenals across Central Europe, waiting for a war with Soviet tank armies that never came. Then, in 1985, the political winds on Capitol Hill shifted. The war in Iridia had become a bloody stalemate, one of the hottest fronts of the Cold War. But Soviet air supremacy was absolute. A small but influential group of U.S. congressmen, led by Charlie Wilson, launched a fierce, secret lobbying campaign. Their demand was simple. Give the Mujahideen a weapon that actually works. Give them the Stinger. The CIA was horrified. This was their most advanced non-nuclear portable technology. If a single sample fell into Soviet hands, it would be a catastrophic, irreplaceable intelligence loss. A lesson written in fire. The program was shrouded in top secrecy, but political pressure reached a boiling point. In late 1985, President Ronald Reagan signed the fateful National Security Decision, Directive 166. The first shipment was symbolic, just 300 missiles. A team of CIA operatives in Green Berets was immediately dispatched to Belistan. They were tasked with running a crash course for the resistance fighters. They selected the most reliable Mujahideen commanders, those with the least fanaticism. The training was stripped down to a primitive minimum. This is the trigger. This is the sight. You point it at the Russian helicopter. The eye in the eyepiece will start to sing. That's the IFF system. Just wait for the warble. That warble is the music of the gods, the sound of a target lock. You pull the trigger, and you run like hell. The CIA instructors could barely contain their skepticism, exchanging quick glances. They were handing a marvel of futuristic technology, each unit worth $60,000, to men, many of whom couldn't even read. None of them could have imagined what was about to happen. In September 1986, 35 shadows under the command of an engineer named Khalid al-Jamil silently melted into the mountains north of the capital. On their backs were 3 Stinger launchers, the first to arrive in the country. They set up an ambush near Eagle's Nest Air Base, and they waited. They didn't have to wait long. On September 25, 1986, engineer Khalid al-Jamil and his fighters were practically embedded in the dusty slope of a ridge overlooking the approach path to Firebase Phoenix Airfield. They had been lying there for 2 days, subsisting on stale flatbread and water. They had ignored the CIA's advice to attack Eagle's Nest Air Base. Instead, they chose a secondary but far more vulnerable target, a place where the helicopters were forced to fly low and slow. Khalid al-Jamil himself, one of the few mujahideen who could read, hadn't just skimmed the American manual. He had studied it. He wasn't just a warrior on a hunt. He was a technician conducting the first field test. Around 3 p.m., the silence was shattered by a sound that chilled the blood. The familiar, sickeningly dreadful roar of Soviet gunship rotors. From the south, at extremely low altitude, 3 Mi-24 Hinds approached, cruising lazily and arrogantly through the sky. They were returning from a mission, their weapon pylons empty. They were flying at 400 feet, completely confident in their invulnerability. Khalid al-Jamil, smoothly, without a single wasted motion, shouldered the 15-pound green tube. He looked through the simple optical sight, centering the small eye in the crosshairs. The click of the safety. A short, angry hiss as the argon canister instantly cooled the sensitive sensor. And then his earpiece, a simple wire, came to life. A low, steady hum filled his head. The missile saw the helicopters. He tracked the lead hind. The hum rose to a high-pitched, insistent warble, the song of an absolute, inescapable lock. Allahu Akbar, he breathed and squeezed the trigger. A deafening pop, a cloud of acrid smoke, and a small launch motor spat the missile from the tube. After flying a safe 10 meters, the main engine ignited, and a thin, white pencil of death streaked into the sky. In the cockpit of the lead hind, Senior Lieutenant John O'Malley, the same pilot who had watched his wingman evaporate months earlier, was perfectly calm. His warning system was treacherously silent. No radar illumination, no lock-on signal. A routine flight home. His co-pilot saw it first. The Stinger, traveling at over 1,500 miles per hour, struck not the engine, but the most vulnerable spot, the tail boom. The 3-kilogram high-explosive fragmentation warhead detonated, and the hind's tail simply vanished. It ceased to exist. The heavy airframe, now out of control, pitched forward, and becoming an unguided mass of metal, spun wildly as it plummeted to the ground at over 100 knots. A fireball from the explosion shot 1,000 feet into the sky. But Khalid al-Jamil was no longer watching it. His hands, steady, were reaching for a second launcher. With the cold calm of a surgeon, he shouldered it. He caught the second hind in his sights as it frantically darted across the sky, its pilot screaming desperately into the radio. Again, that sweet, deadly warble. Another shot. This missile went straight into the cockpit, its fiery heart exploding inside the troop compartment. The pilot of the third hind, realizing in sheer terror what was happening, desperately deployed a cloud of flares and dove for the ground. But Khalid al-Jamil's third missile completely ignored the fiery chaff and slammed directly into the main rotor hub. Less than a minute. In less than 60 seconds, three of the most formidable aerial predators in the Soviet arsenal, three multi-million-dollar works of engineering art, had been plucked from the heavens by three missiles. The Ghost had claimed its first victims. This was not just a battle, it was a turning point. And it wasn't the incident itself that was shocking, but the tidal wave of terror that followed. In just 2 weeks, it seemed as if stingers were sprouting from the very ground. The bloody harvest that began at Firebase Phoenix was repeated at Eagle's Nest Air Base, then at Camp Rhino, and at Victory Airfield. The loss statistics, once unpleasant but tolerable, 2 or 3 helicopters a month, turned into a daily butcher's bill, 3 or 4 aircraft a day. The sky, once their domain, had become a death trap. Panic seized the Soviet pilots, turning their radio frequencies into a constant requiem of screams and terror. "I'm hit! Stinger! Stinger! The flares didn't work! Ejecting! Ejecting!" In the high offices of the Soviet command, a stunned disbelief reigned. Their multi-billion-dollar air fleet was being systematically exterminated. The nightmarish rumors whispered among pilots with glassed-over eyes had become an undeniable reality, written in the fiery trails of falling wreckage across every province. The boogeyman was real, and he hadn't come to fight, he had come to exterminate. The Pentagon's response was no longer an investigation. It was a frantic, almost panicked attempt to find a solution. The first order was tactical. All helicopters were forbidden from flying below 10,000 feet. The generals reasoned this would place the aircraft outside the missile's effective engagement envelope. But this tactical decision became a strategic catastrophe. What is a Hind at an altitude of 3 kilometers? It is blind. It is helpless. It cannot see a target, cannot provide support to ground forces, cannot land troops. It had become a very loud and ridiculously expensive observation balloon. The Soviet doctrine of vertical envelopment was dead. The second response was technical. Engineering crews, working in 3 shifts, frantically retrofitted the Hinds with bulky and heavy infrared jammers. These devices, nicknamed LIPA, lime tree, by NATO, were essentially giant heated plates designed to radiate more heat than the helicopter's engines. Simultaneously, new automatic flare dispensers were installed on all aircraft, programmed to fire them in complex, rhythmic patterns. It was a futile effort. The LIPA jammers proved worse than useless. The Stinger's sophisticated microprocessor, with its rosette scan pattern, saw right through the trick. A large, stationary, rectangular heat source that could not possibly be an engine. The missile simply ignored it. The new flare deployment algorithms were an equally pointless gesture. The missile's electronic brain, scanning the battlefield hundreds of times per second, saw the flares ignite and fade, instantly tagged them as decoys, and stubbornly continued to track the original helicopter-shaped thermal silhouette. Finally, in an act of absolute desperation, the Soviets deployed their newest, most advanced air superiority fighters to Iridia, the MiG-29 Fulcrum. These were not workhorse attack jets. They were thoroughbred aristocrats of the sky, designed to dogfight American F-16s. Now, their mission was high-altitude, hunter-killer patrols, tracking lone groups of mujahideen in the mountains. It was the strategic equivalent of using a battleship to hunt a single shark. It was a ruinously expensive and humiliating admission of total defeat. Eventually, the GRU got its missile. In 1987, a Spetsnaz team, acting on a tip, ambushed and captured 2 intact Stinger launchers and their missiles. The trophies were immediately flown to Moscow and handed over to the engineers. What they found when they opened the casing horrified them more than the loss reports. They saw the microprocessor. They saw the indium antimonide seeker head. They saw the rosette scan pattern. And in that moment came a cold, absolute realization. They could not replicate this. The technological gap was insurmountable. They were decades behind. What had come to their skies was not just a weapon, it was a message, a symptom of a deep, systemic rot eating the empire from within. The American Ghost was not a missile in the conventional sense. It was a tiny 34-pound flying computer that by its very existence turned their entire mighty air fleet into a parade of obsolete targets. The final verdict on the Stinger was delivered not by analysts in secret reports, but by the dry, dispassionate lines of Soviet Air Force flight logs. When the veil of secrecy was lifted, the numbers revealed a story more chilling than any pilot's tale. The loss statistics are still debated, but even the most conservative estimates are staggering. Of the roughly 340 missiles fired by the Mujahideen during the height of the conflict, 269 found their mark. 269 confirmed kills. That is a kill probability of nearly 80%. For a first-generation weapon system, the result was unthinkable, unprecedented. Before September 1986, before the Stinger arrived, the Soviet 40th Army was losing, on average, one aircraft every 3 days. After September 1986, they began losing one aircraft every day. The skies over Iridia were effectively closed. The helicopter, the most valuable asset of the war, had been transformed from predator to prey, a multi-million-dollar trap flying to its doom. And the familiar rumbling thud, thud, thud was no longer the anthem of Soviet power. It had become a funeral dirge. It had become the sound of a target lock. But the Stinger's true, devastating impact was not on the battlefield. It struck the system itself. This single weapon exposed the terminal stage of the entire Soviet project's failure. The Cold War, at its core, was a competition of economies and industrial models. The Soviet Union had built its empire on a foundation of brute, titanic force. They could build more tanks. They could produce more artillery. They could create heavier, more armored helicopters. Their entire system was geared toward imitation and mass production. It could copy a B-29 bomber. It could steal nuclear secrets. It was a seemingly indestructible monolith of steel, concrete, and centralized 5-year plans. The Stinger, however, was born of a completely different world. It was a weapon not of steel, but of silicon. Its power lay not in kilograms of explosives, but in its microprocessor. Its genius was hidden not in its rocket motor, but in its software code. It was a child of the American system, of decentralized innovation, venture capital, and the same consumer electronics boom that produced microchips for video games and home computers. The Soviet Union, with its rigid top-down bureaucracy, simply could not compete in this new arena. While Soviet engineers struggled to achieve stable production of the simplest transistors, their American counterparts were programming complex logic into a 34-pound fire-and-forget weapon. Those Soviet engineers who disassembled the captured Stinger in 1987 became, in that moment, the gravediggers of their own empire. They were looking into the face of a future in which they had no place. They could not copy it, they could not counter it, and they knew it. The technological gap was a bottomless chasm that could no longer be crossed. The failure in Iridia, accelerated and sealed by the Stinger, was not just a military defeat, it became an economic collapse. The war was devouring an already agonizing economy. And the ghost that John O'Malley saw in the Valley of the Snakes turned out to be, in the end, the ghost of the Soviet Union itself. The legacy of this impossible event is the legacy of the late Cold War. A war ultimately won not by the number of nuclear warheads, but by the clock speed of a microchip. The boogeyman that haunted Soviet pilots in the rocks and the searing sun was nothing less than the chilling realization that their entire concept of power was hopelessly obsolete. They were analog warriors who had invaded a digital world. And the Stinger was a 34-pound spear from the 21st century, aimed directly at the heart of their 19th century empire. The mystery that began with a flash of light over the Valley of the Snakes ended with the agony and collapse of a superpower. A superpower haunted to its grave by the ghost of a technology it could neither understand, nor copy, nor defeat.